Final word, Professor Wolff.
Yeah, there's two things. Socialism, if you look at Marx and folks like that who are leading exponents of what this is all about, I'm going to say it now in as blunted terms as I can in the interest of time. They don't have much to do with the government. This is a modern notion that the government doing things is some kind of definition of socialism. If you read Marx's Capital, the critique of capitalism has to do with a division of people in the process of production between a minority that are employers and a majority that are employees, and that this is seen as capitalism's version of the similar dichotomy between lords and serfs in feudalism and masters and slaves in slavery, and that socialism is the negation of those kinds of dichotomies in favor of a different relationship in producing the goods and services we depend on, that of a community, hence the word communism, in which we democratically all together decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the fruits of our labor. Notice I haven't said a word about the government. That's a different issue. The only reason government looms large is the strategic decision in the 19th centuries of socialist movements to say to themselves and to the rest of the world, we're going to seize the government in order to use it to make the transition to socialism. But seizing the government isn't itself the transition to socialism. That's craziness, because socialism is a reorganization of the system of production of goods and services, and that's not a question of who does it, government or private. It's a question of how it's done, government or private. And a socialist society would have, presumably, both governmental and non-governmental democratic organizations of production. Mr. Brooks is so ignorant about the history of...
Sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Please keep going.
He is so ignorant of the history of socialism that he has no idea and deals with this government, this fetishism of the government, as if it were a universally agreed truth. It never was. It isn't now. It's embarrassing that he lives in the bubble that requires affirming something so stone cold wrong.
And just to put another point on it, and this is for Forrest, this is a separate segment, but Ben, hang on a few minutes. I think this is really important. So unlike the libertarians, so you have a government which is still rooted in this, liberal democracies. And that's the idea basically that at least in the realm of governance, the realm of civil society, will evolve, we'll have a revolution, we'll get rid of monarchy. But in the private sector, we'll still have the divine right of kings, the divine right of the shareholder. Inside the enterprise. Inside the enterprise. That's why they're fundamentally... I actually read a book once. It was a very interesting book by a business management theorist. And it was actually a critique of the trends in management consulting. There was a trend for a while in the 90s that was like, we need to democratize the workplace. Now, they didn't mean actually democratize the workplace. They meant make it friendlier, make people... And this critique was interesting because it was actually... It wasn't Marxist, but he actually was making a delineation. He was saying, look, in politics, we have a democracy, and it is not business. And in business... this ain't a democracy. And we need to be clear about what those differences were. And there was actually a lot of integrity in that argument, even though I disagreed with some of it. But the point is not just that Marxists or socialists are trying to, So, and then libertarians say, oh, it's just the government. There's always this thing called government that just oppresses us. Yes. And it's not the government as an agent that is co-opted by the private divine rights of kings, which is how government works in most of the world. It's just an agent of the corporate sector. Marxists say, what happens if you seize the government and you didn't get rid of it? Obviously, there's always a government, but you also didn't just make the old mechanisms of government work a little bit more nicely. You said government is going to be reconstituted because we got rid of the divine right of king in the private sector. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. And that, in the book, I try very hard to make it clear that whatever you think about socialism, you have to be aware that there's basically the three kinds. One, the government regulates private enterprise and leaves it there. Two, the government becomes the enterprise owner-operator, the Soviet model, at least in hypothetical. And number three, that it's got nothing to do with the government. It has to do with a radical reorganization of work and all that that means in the lives of people. With the government as an afterthought, it will be created the way capitalism did it, by getting rid of the old feudal government and reconstituting it on the basis of capitalism to serve capitalism. That's exactly what a democratized workplace economy will do for a new government that serves it.
Yeah, and I think that this is a point that's worth emphasizing because it's, in a weird way, it's kind of parallel to the way that like centrist Democrats like to accuse anybody who critiques them from the left of practicing purity politics. There's a way that in these discussions about what socialism has meant or could mean, you know, people will sort of say, "Oh, you're just being like a purist about definitions," or you're being, you know, you're playing no true Scotsman, maybe, you know, that if something's bad, it's not socialist, you know, and I think that's wrong for a couple reasons, but just for the sake of time, just to focus in on what's most relevant to what Professor Wolff is saying. That, you know, at the risk of, you know, pissing off, you know, tanky viewers who may be the only group more overrepresented on the internet as a percentage of the real world than libertarians are, you know, the reason that you know that I think it's important to differentiate out, you know, what we mean by socialism, you know, what kind of socialism we have in mind from what existed in countries like the Soviet Union, isn't that nothing where anything went badly, or, you know, or that where there was a problem, or that, you know, where crimes were committed even, you know, could count as socialist. It's that the heart of the project, the whole point, is to extend democracy to the economy in order to create a classless society. If the government is, if you have the government as the owner of the means of production, or of some part of the means of production, well, maybe others are, you know, owned by cooperatives or whatever. And I mean, this is a distinction that Ingalls, or one of my favorite Marxists, the Irish revolutionary James Connolly, talked about endlessly, that, you know, so that government ownership is socialism to the extent that the government is owned by ordinary working people. That, you know, that because if that's the case, if you have radical bottom-up democratic control of the government, and then the government is controlling the means of production, then you don't have that distinction between a class of owners and a class of workers anymore. Whereas if the government is not controlled by the people, but it controls the means of production, then you don't have a classless society. You just have a new ruling class of state bureaucrats.
There it is. And then I think the next part of the conversation we'll have at a future date, hopefully not too far in the future, is different labor strategies and how they relate to all three of those paths. But I think that that's very important, because the last thing I'll say, I've learned from Professor Wolff, and I think it's very clear in anybody we talk about on the show, like Thomas Sankara, whose birthday was just a couple days ago, is that it isn't just and really maybe this is actually a kind of, because I am a social democrat in the current context in terms of the ground we're on. That's where I'm at. But the shift is a broader, more aggressive strategic socialist view, is that you want to ultimately take over the power structures, not just ameliorate them so they're friendlier. And that is a fundamental outlook difference. And it also does challenge the idea that there does need to be those hierarchies, which I think we all actually really fundamentally reject. Anyways, Ben Burgis, give them an argument. Logic for the left. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. See you next Friday.
See you next Friday. Or wait, is it next or the week after?
See. So
it's next. So we'll find out.
Friday of next week. You know, so
perfect. All right, brother. You know. See you soon.
Right. Neither of us could do math.
Neither of us could do math. We reject math. I should say that on the Tuesday we're not going to be back. from vacation, but we're going to have a show the first week of January. It's going to be on Friday, and Ben Burgis is going to be in studio, and Megan Day is going to be the guest over the phone. I'm very eager to do that.
I will see you there, or I will see you on another time.
Exactly. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.